Okay, the Department of Justice released the entirety of the Ghislaine Maxwell transcripts. That would be the conversations between Pam Bondi's Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, and Ghislaine Maxwell, who's been convicted of trafficking underage girls to Jeffrey Epstein. She's serving decades in federal prison as a result of that conviction. After our outcry, the Department of Justice sat down with Ghislaine Maxwell. Kind of unbelievable that they hadn't done that before, that no Department of Justice had ever asked Ghislaine Maxwell about Jeffrey Epstein specifically. Mind-blowing, actually. So kudos to the Department of Justice for doing this, but also I find it a little hard to praise people for just doing the bare minimum what they're expected to do. Good job, Department of Justice. But there are some takeaways from these transcripts. First of all, it's important to understand that Ghislaine Maxwell is not a good person. She's a criminal, and she's the worst kind of criminal. She trafficked underage girls to a pedophile, and she's serving time in prison for it, which she should be. But the lens through which we should all be looking at everything that comes out of Ghislaine Maxwell's mouth is through the lens of understanding that she's not only a criminal, but she's not an honest person. You don't commit that kind of crime by accident. You don't commit that kind of crime just by association. She was actively taking part in Epstein's sex crimes against children. That being said, almost everything that she says, I take with a grain of salt because of that. She's also, by the way, not just taking part in this interview because she wants to help. No, she's sucking up to President Trump because she wants a pardon. She doesn't want to spend the rest of her life in federal prison, even if it's a cushy prison in Texas, even if she gets to have a prison BFF like Elizabeth Holmes, who was convicted for her Theranos fraud. No, Ghislaine Maxwell is a criminal who's been convicted of sex trafficking underage girls to Jeffrey Epstein. She's not honest. She's sucking up to Trump for a pardon. And to be honest, the more I read of these transcripts, the back and forth between Maxwell and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, it didn't answer my questions. It raised more questions. So let's walk through a little bit of what we learned from these transcripts. First of all, Ghislaine Maxwell does not think that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. So on that, I suppose she agrees with the majority of the American people. This is the exchange between Todd Blanche and Ghislaine Maxwell. Blanche says, so, what I do want to be careful about is, asking you to speculate, because anybody can do that. And I don't think that's fair to you or anybody else to ask you to give us kind of your opinion. But do you think that the third point you say, which is kind of a failure by the BOP, that's the Bureau of Prisons, there's an OIG, Office of the Inspector General report. There's SDNY investigation about that. So you think he did not die by suicide, given all the things we just talked about? And by the way, just to prepare you, this is how Todd Blanche talks. So if you're looking for very succinct, cut and dry questions, you're not going to find them in this conversation. Ghislaine Maxwell responded very succinctly and says, I quote, I do not believe he died by suicide. No. Todd Blanche says, and do you have any speculation or view of who killed him? Ghislaine Maxwell says, no, I don't. Todd Blanche says, and I ask that because if you don't believe that there's any truth to the allegations of blackmail, or that he had kind of a list, or that he had reasons to have people hate him, why would someone kill him in prison? Ghislaine Maxwell responds by saying, in prison where I am, they will kill you, or they will pay. Somebody can pay a prisoner to kill you for $25 worth of commissary. That's about the going rate for a hit. Todd Blanche says, so that goes to the third reason, which is kind of the mismanagement. Ghislaine Maxwell says, yes. Todd Blanche says, or the shortfallings or shortcomings of the Bureau of Prisons. I'm going to pause right there and say, does it feel like he's leading her to her answers? Because it feels to me like these are not open-ended questions, that these are him planting ideas. Ghislaine Maxwell says, yes. And Todd Blanche says, well, which is a little different than my question is, which is, do you think that there was somebody on the outside of prison? So putting aside what could happen on the inside, on the outside of prison, who wanted him dead so badly that he would have, or she would have, caused him to be killed on the inside? Ghislaine Maxwell says, I don't see that. I think, is it possible? Of course it's possible. But I don't know of any reason why, and I don't believe in the blackmail or in any of this. I don't think Epstein had a hit on like that. If it is indeed murder, I believe it was an internal situation. Todd Blanche says, yeah, so you don't have any reason, firsthand knowledge, or even speculation, it sounds like, to think that he was killed to kind of silence him or keep him from going public about people he knew about. Ghislaine Maxwell says, I don't know, because I think that that is just part of the story that's been created that started back in 2008, 2009. Todd Blanche says, okay, yeah, I mean, that's the point. Like, I don't think there's value in talking, there's a lot of information about what happened, at the MCC, and what is important to me is whether, this is how Todd Blanche, word for word, is speaking, is the idea that he didn't die by suicide. That's one thing. But if, to the extent that folks believe he was murdered to keep him quiet, or believe he had information on rich and powerful people, do you have any reason to believe that that's true? Ghislaine Maxwell says, I do not have any reason to believe that. And I also think it's ludicrous, because I also happen to think that is what they wanted, they would have had plenty of opportunity when he wasn't in jail. And if they were worried about blackmail or anything from him, he would have been a very easy target. Okay. So what is the takeaway from this conversation? The takeaway from this portion of the conversation is Todd Blanche is leading Ghislaine Maxwell to the conclusion. I don't know what Todd Blanche believes. I don't know Todd Blanche personally, but he's clearly forming the conversation to get her to agree with him, not asking open-ended questions. I don't know why he would talk like that. That's not what I would do if I were sitting across from Ghislaine Maxwell. That's certainly not the way that I would speak. I would be clearer in my questions. I would form my questions as proper sentences. I would ask open-ended questions and then follow-ups. I wouldn't say, this is what I believe. Do you agree? That's not going to beget any useful information. So Ghislaine Maxwell doesn't think Epstein killed himself. She also says she doesn't think that it was some gigantic hit. She thinks it was something from the inside. Okay, well, she doesn't know. Again, she's a criminal. She's in prison. Make of that what you will. Ghislaine Maxwell also says in these transcripts that she doesn't think that there is an Epstein client list. She says that she also believes there's no blackmail. Listen, it's those portions of the interview that I take with a grain of salt, because I assume she has some kind of agreement with the Department of Justice against implicating herself if she were to do that. But I still don't think that without the promise of release, of pardon, of clemency at the very least, that she would implicate herself. So if there were a client list, then she would have been part of supplying those underage girls to those clients. If there was blackmail, she would have been aware of that. Of course, she's going to deny it, because there would be some way of getting her that the Department of Justice couldn't protect her against if she were to admit that. So I take that with a grain of salt. I don't care about her opinions on those matters. Todd Blanche then asked her whether she had any knowledge of Epstein being paid by Israel's intelligence apparatus, the Mossad. This is what Todd Blanche said. So I'm going to ask you questions that you shouldn't read into them. I just want to know whether they resonate with you. Have you ever had any contact with any representative that you know of from Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency? Ghislaine Maxwell responds and says, can you ask me that again? Todd Blanche says, have you ever had any contact with an individual that you understand to be from Mossad, an Israeli intelligence agency? Ghislaine Maxwell says, well, not deliberately. Todd Blanche says, pardon me? Ghislaine Maxwell says, not deliberately. Todd Blanche says, okay, and did you know? We asked this, we talked about this a bit earlier, but just to put a finer point on it, did you ever know that were you ever told, did you ever think that Mr. Epstein was getting any money from any intelligence agency, including Mossad? Ghislaine Maxwell says, well, I don't believe so, but I wouldn't know. I mean, I would be very surprised if he did. I don't think so. No. Todd Blanche says, we've talked about a lot of names, and I'm sure there's some that we haven't covered. Are there any foreign nationals? So right now we've talked about some British, the royal family a little bit, maybe high society folks in Britain. Were there any international businessmen or politicians that had a very close relationship with Mr. Epstein that we haven't talked about? We haven't already talked about. Ghislaine Maxwell says, off the top of my head, I can think of Ehud Barak. Todd Blanche says, you said that Mr. Epstein at some point in the mid to late 1990s, he started taking testosterone. Did you ever know him to take any other drugs? Ghislaine Maxwell says, no. I mean, he took pills for his heart, I think, but I don't know no substances. Todd Blanche says, what do you know about his heart condition? Okay, pause the transcript there. First of all, Ehud Barak is the former prime minister of Israel. So Ghislaine Maxwell volunteers of her own volition that Jeffrey Epstein had a very close relationship with the former prime minister of Israel, and Todd Blanche didn't ask any follow-up questions? What? This entire portion of the transcript is like whiplash-inducing subject change. There's not a single question. Oh, what kind of relationship? Did they do business together? Did they do intelligence together? Were they personal friends? Can you detail why you just stated of your own volition that Jeffrey Epstein had a close relationship with the former Prime Minister of Israel? But nothing. Todd Blanche asks nothing. Listen, I'm not going to speculate about why that is. I don't know why Todd Blanche would not ask a question. It does beget more questions than it answers, though. Was he instructed not to ask anything further if the topic of Israel is brought up? Is he just bad at asking questions? Because that's pretty elementary to follow up on such volunteered information. This seems, and I mean, go a little bit further back in the transcript too, when he says, have you ever had any contact with an individual that you understood to be from Mossad, an Israeli intelligence agency? Ghislaine Maxwell says, not deliberately. And then his follow-up question was, did Epstein get any money from Mossad? Wait a second. Why wouldn't you ask, what do you mean when you say not deliberately? Do you mean that you did have contact with agents of the Mossad, but they just instigated that contact? What kind of relationships? Who were these people? What did they want from Epstein? What did Epstein do or not do with them? How are there not detailed questions when Ghislaine Maxwell actually does produce some interesting answers? But Todd Blanche's follow-up question narrows it to this, did he get any money from the Mossad? To my understanding, there's never been any allegations that Epstein got money from the Mossad. My understanding of the allegations of Epstein, quote unquote, belonging to intelligence is that he was an off-the-books associate of some intelligence agencies, the US, maybe Britain, maybe France, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Israel, we don't know, but that he wasn't paid directly as an employee or as a source of any of these intel agencies, that he was used, again, off the books to broker deals the governments didn't want to look like they were associated with. And so, no, he wouldn't have gotten money directly from the Mossad. No one's saying that he did, except, I guess, Todd Blanche. Okay, Ghislaine Maxwell also confirmed that her father, Robert Maxwell, was an intel agent, that he was Israeli intel. Pardon me, that he was Israeli intel. She then said that Epstein never met her father, which, again, it really wasn't that specific. So what do you mean when you say he hadn't met? Did you mean that Epstein never met your father in person? Did he ever communicate with your father? Did he send text messages, emails? Did he FaceTime? Did he talk on the phone? Did he get coffee in person? What does that mean when you say you hadn't met, or Epstein hadn't met her father? I don't know what that means. Again, Todd Blanche didn't ask a follow-up question that clarifies at all. So really this interaction just begets more questions. It doesn't answer our questions. Todd Blanche asked Ghislaine Maxwell whether Epstein had any contacts with the FBI. But again, the way that this question is phrased is so narrow that it doesn't answer any questions. Todd Blanche says, so did you ever know Mr. Epstein to communicate with FBI agents, either like intelligence FBI agents, like as a source, or just generally with FBI agents? Ghislaine Maxwell says, no. Okay, but the question was, as a source. Well, again, the allegations against Epstein aren't really that he was a source so much as an off-the-books liaison. Todd Blanche then says, do you think if he had done that, you would have known? Like he would have told you something like that? Like if I said to you, Mr. Epstein was a source for the FBI, would you say that's crazy? No, he wasn't. Or maybe he was. He wouldn't have told me that anyway. Again, he's planting ideas in her mind of different ways that she can answer this. Ghislaine Maxwell says, I have two answers for that. I think if he was for real, I think he would have bragged about it to me as a show off, because he could be a show off. And if he wasn't, he might have dropped it like he was cool. And I don't remember him doing either. Again, the question was so narrow. In fact, it reminded me when I first began working in this industry back when I was on cable news a decade ago. One of the pieces of advice I got for how to conduct an interview it was actually someone who wasn't a show host. It was someone who was a writer, but who had interviewed a lot of people. He said to me, when you're interviewing guests, don't ask a question and provide the binary options of these are the only two things that you can say, unless it's a situation where you just want someone to repeat, like, yes, this is my position. But if you are fishing for information, ask the question and refrain from giving option A and option B as the only two binary choices that you can ask. And yet this is what Todd Blanche is doing, is he's providing, here are the different options. Here's the multiple choice answers that you can pick from. Instead of just asking her about associations, he then gives her options of the different types of associations there might be. It begets more questions than it answers. He asked her in general about ties to intel agencies by saying this. Todd Blanche says, and what about any other intel agencies like the CIA or Defense Intelligence or any other law enforcement agency? Ghislaine Maxwell said, okay, I don't think so. I think that I don't remember anything like that. I just don't think he had the wherewithal. And I think that whole aspect of that is, can I use a bad word? She asks. Her attorney says yes. Todd Blanche says yes. And Ghislaine Maxwell says bullshit. Well, again, she's looking for a pardon from President Trump. So maybe take that with a grain of salt. Maybe one of the most interesting things that we learned from this interview is confirmation that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein helped start the Clinton Foundation. Ghislaine Maxwell said, I went on a trip with the president to South America. Todd Blanche says, with which president? Ghislaine says, oh, sorry, President Clinton. Todd Blanche says, yeah, okay, just you know. Ghislaine says, sorry. Todd Blanche says, I just wanted to make sure it was clear. Okay, so you went on a trip to where? Ghislaine says, Latin America. Blanche says, and who? And so Ms. Mills was on that trip? Ghislaine Maxwell says, she was. Todd Blanche says, and President Clinton was on that trip. Ghislaine says, he was. Todd Blanche says, who else was on that trip? Ghislaine says, Doug Band. Todd Blanche says, who worked with President Clinton? Ghislaine says, yes. Todd Blanche says, and was Mr. Epstein? Ghislaine says, no. Todd Blanche says, and what was the purpose of that trip? Ghislaine Maxwell says, well, the president had, I don't know. I mean, the president met with, I can't even remember I know presidents, and we were Todd Blanche says, was this part of President Clinton's work after he left office with his foundation, or was meaning what? Ghislaine says, I don't think the foundation, Todd Blanche says, was it something for him, or was it? Ghislaine then says, I don't remember when the Clinton Global Initiative started. So if you give me the date, I can tell you if that was pre or post, because without that, I can't pin the reason. David Marcus says, do you remember what it was for or not? Ghislaine Maxwell says, no, I don't recall. But in that interaction, she reveals again something that's been largely reported, but up until now, not necessarily confirmed, that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were a large part of the beginning of the Clinton Global Initiative. So they had a much closer relationship to Bill Clinton than the mainstream media wants you to remember. Here's the thing. These transcripts raise more questions than they answer, predominantly because of two reasons. Because Ghislaine Maxwell is a convicted criminal, convicted of sex trafficking. She's not an honest person. She's not a good person. She has an ulterior motive here, which is pretty obvious. She wants a pardon from the president. So she spent a lot of time sucking up to the president. She, said that he wasn't involved in anything, which I think we all largely agree. We would know if President Trump was involved in anything shady related to Epstein. That would have come out years ago. He's not. He kicked Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago when he found out that Epstein was poaching young girls from his spa. And he's advocated for the victims of Epstein for a long time. We all know that President Trump knew him, but wasn't associated with his crimes. Ghislaine emphasized that because she wants a pardon. She wants clemency. But the other thing that I think sticks out about these transcripts is that the questions were not constructed in a way that's going to beget any kind of useful leads. That being said, there is a way. You could even argue that it's an easier way, a quicker way, a more effective way of getting to the bottom of the question that underpins the entire Epstein scandal. And the question that underpins the entire Epstein scandal is, why was Epstein let off easy in 2007 for allegations that he committed sex crimes against underage girls? And we have a partial answer to that given by Alex Acosta, the former U.S. attorney, the one who cut that sweetheart deal. He said during a 2020 interview with the Department of Justice, OPR, Office of Professional Responsibility, it was an investigation into why that deal was cut. Alex Acosta said, I was told to back off because Epstein belonged to intelligence. So in a nutshell, the allegation against Jeffrey Epstein was that he committed sex crimes against underage girls. That's why he was in prison. But that he was let off easy in 2007 because he belonged to intelligence. So the question is, what does that mean? What work did he do for or with intelligence agencies, and which intelligence agencies? Ours? And if so, which ones? Foreign intel agencies? And if so, which ones? And what deals was he involved in? And the easiest way to get to the bottom of this question, which will then answer, it'll have a cascading effect, it'll answer almost all of the rest of the questions, is to release the transcript of that Alex Acosta interview with Department of Justice OPR. We need to know exactly what Alex Acosta was asked and exactly what he answered. We need to know the context of everything else that he was asked and every other answer he gave and what questions he wasn't asked. We need actually to hear from Alex Acosta himself. But in the meantime, before that's possible, and I'm not sure why it's not possible, I'm not sure why he's not speaking out against this, Attorney General Pam Bondi has the authority to release that Alex Acosta transcript. So sure, it's great the Department of Justice finally interviewed Ghislaine Maxwell. It's about time that happened. Her answers begot more questions than they answered. But we could get to the bottom of this so much quicker if Pam Bondi would release that transcript of Alex Acosta. Raise your voices. You're so powerful when you take part in this administration. When you hold accountable individuals who are an impediment to the America First agenda that President Trump espouses and that we share with him. We voted for President Trump for the justice that we saw on Friday morning when President Trump's FBI, under the helm of FBI Director Kash Patel, raided the home of John Bolton, who abused his position in the first Trump administration, allegedly sent himself highly sensitive classified information outside of the White House, and then allegedly trafficked that intelligence, possibly in foreign nations, and possibly profiting from that trafficking. That's the justice we voted for. And when there's an individual, an employee in the Trump administration, and there's a lot of people in the Trump administration, so there's bound to be some bad apples, there's bound to be some infiltrators, there's bound to be some people that just aren't competent. When there is somebody who becomes an impediment to the justice that President Trump promised us when we cast our votes for him, we need to call that person out. We need to bring that to President Trump's attention because we want President Trump's administration to be the sharpest that it can be. Attorney General Pam Bondi has failed multiple times on the rollout of the Epstein files, on procuring justice for the allegations that the reason Epstein was let off easy was because deep state swamp creatures wanted to cover his ties to intelligence. But she has an opportunity now to somewhat make that right. She has the opportunity to show us that she actually does care about justice. And she can do so that quickly by releasing this transcript of Alex Acosta talking to the Department of Justice OPR in 2020. So raise your voice and ask her, why have you not done this? And demand that she do it now.